The hardest relationships to leave are not always the ones filled with constant conflict. Sometimes, they are the ones that give you just enough emotional connection to keep you hoping for more. That is where the empath-avoidant dynamic can become so powerful. An empath may enter the relationship thinking, "I understand them. I can see what they're struggling with. I know there's a softer side underneath their distance." And that perception can create an emotional bond long before the avoidant partner has actually created emotional safety. The empath notices subtle changes, a warmer message, a rare vulnerable conversation, a moment when the avoidant finally opens up. Those moments can feel incredibly meaningful because they seem to reveal something hidden beneath the emotional walls. But here is the deeper issue. The empath can become attached not only to the person, but to the possibility of who that person could become. When the avoidant pulls away, the empath's natural instinct may be to understand, reassure, accommodate, and give more space. Instead of asking, "Is this relationship meeting my emotional needs?" the focus slowly shifts toward, "What does this person need from me to finally feel safe?" And that shift changes everything. The empath starts carrying emotional responsibility that does not belong entirely to them. They become patient with inconsistency. They explain away distance. They celebrate tiny moments of closeness because those moments feel like proof that the connection is still alive. Meanwhile, the avoidant may genuinely care, but still struggle with intimacy, vulnerability, or emotional dependence. This creates a powerful loop. The more the avoidant withdraws, the more the empath tries to understand. The more the empath tries to connect, the more pressure the avoidant may feel. And the more the avoidant retreats, the more intensely the empath searches for the connection they briefly experienced. The attraction isn't necessarily proof that these two people are meant to be together. Sometimes it is a signal that empathy, emotional uncertainty, and attachment wounds have collided. And recognizing that pattern is where the cycle finally begins to lose its power. Some connections don't simply feel romantic. They feel psychologically magnetic. You can know someone is emotionally inconsistent, recognize the distance, and still feel pulled toward them with an intensity you can't easily explain. The empath-avoidant connection can create exactly that kind of pull. An empath naturally pays attention to emotional details, a change in tone, a pause before answering, a sudden withdrawal. These small signals can become highly meaningful. When an avoidant partner occasionally reveals vulnerability, the empath may experience that moment as something precious. And then the distance returns. That contrast is where the emotional intensity can grow. Warmth followed by withdrawal creates uncertainty, and uncertainty can make the mind search harder for answers. Instead of experiencing the relationship as a steady emotional connection, the empath may begin chasing the next moment of closeness. Why were they so open yesterday, but distant today? What changed? Did I do something wrong? Those questions can quietly transform affection into emotional monitoring. The avoidant partner may not be intentionally creating this effect. Their withdrawal can come from discomfort with vulnerability, fear of dependence, difficulty communicating emotions, or a strong need for personal space. But regardless of intention, the emotional impact on the empath can still be powerful. The empath may start believing that the relationship contains a hidden depth that simply needs to be unlocked. Every small breakthrough becomes evidence. Every retreat becomes a problem to solve. Every return feels like confirmation. This is why the attraction can become stronger, precisely when the relationship becomes less predictable. The empath isn't necessarily addicted to the person's distance. They may become attached to the emotional relief that arrives when the distance temporarily disappears. That relief feels powerful because it temporarily ends the uncertainty. But healthy intimacy doesn't require you to constantly earn someone's emotional presence. Real connection has room for mystery, independence, and personal space. But it also contains consistency, communication, and emotional safety. And once an empath understands this difference, the magnetic pull begins to look different. What once felt like undeniable chemistry may reveal itself as a cycle of anticipation, uncertainty, relief, and renewed hope. That realization can become the first crack in the pattern. The real trap isn't always the person standing in front of you. Sometimes, it's the pattern your nervous system learns around them. An empath and an avoidant can enter a relationship with completely different emotional instincts. The empath tends to move toward connection, talking, understanding, repairing, reassuring. The avoidant tends to move toward space when emotional intensity rises. At first, these differences can feel strangely complementary. The empath thinks, "I can help them feel safe." The avoidant may feel, "This person understands me without demanding too much." That creates an unusual sense of recognition. But once emotional vulnerability increases, the same qualities that created attraction can begin producing tension. The empath notices distance and reaches for clarity. The avoidant experiences that emotional pursuit as pressure and creates more distance. The empath then becomes even more focused on restoring closeness, and the avoidant retreats further. This is the pursue-withdraw loop. What makes this pattern especially powerful is that both people can unintentionally reinforce it. The empath's increased effort may temporarily bring the avoidant closer. That brief reconnection feels rewarding, so the empath learns, if I stay patient and give more, we can get back to that closeness. But the avoidant may also learn something. Distance reduces emotional pressure. So both partners receive short-term relief from behaviors that keep the long-term problem alive. Then another layer appears: interpretation. The empath may interpret withdrawal as hidden fear. They care, but they're scared. The avoidant may interpret emotional intensity as loss of freedom. I need room before this becomes too much. Neither interpretation necessarily captures the whole truth. The result is a relationship where both people react to what they believe the other person's behavior means, rather than clearly addressing what is actually happening. That is why breaking this pattern requires more than understanding attachment styles. You have to recognize the moment when compassion turns into emotional responsibility, and independence turns into emotional avoidance. The goal isn't to make the avoidant chase or make the empath care less. The goal is to create a relationship where closeness doesn't require chasing and space doesn't require disappearing. That is where the psychological pattern finally begins to change. An avoidant's silence can create a strange emotional pressure. The less they give, the more the empath feels compelled to give. And that is where a caring heart can slowly become trapped in a cycle of over-effort. When an avoidant withdraws, the empath often notices the change immediately. The conversations become shorter. Affection feels different. Emotional availability drops. Instead of stepping back and observing the situation, the empath may instinctively move closer. They explain more. They reassure more. They become more patient. They lower their expectations. Not because they don't have needs, but because they believe understanding the avoidant will eventually bring the connection back. This is where empathy can quietly become emotional over-responsibility. The empath starts asking, "What can I do differently?" rather than, "What is this relationship actually giving me?" That question seems small, but it changes the entire emotional balance. Instead of expecting the avoidant to communicate, the empath learns to decode silence. Instead of allowing the avoidant to repair emotional distance, the empath reaches out first. Instead of expressing disappointment, they become increasingly careful because they don't want to push the avoidant away. Then something particularly powerful happens. The avoidant returns. Maybe with a warm message, maybe with affection, maybe with a vulnerable conversation that hasn't happened for weeks. That brief reconnection can feel incredibly rewarding. The empath thinks, "See, they do care. I just need to be patient." And suddenly, all the previous pain gets reinterpreted as temporary. This creates a dangerous emotional bargain. If I give enough, understand enough, and expect little enough, maybe I can keep the connection. But love should not require one person to continuously shrink their needs so the other person can remain comfortable. Empathy is understanding someone without abandoning yourself. If your compassion constantly requires silence about your own needs, it has crossed into self-neglect. The turning point comes when the empath stops asking, "How can I make this person stay?" and starts asking, "Can this person meet me with the same emotional responsibility I'm bringing?" That question doesn't destroy genuine connection. It reveals whether genuine connection is actually there. One person reaches for closeness, the other reaches for distance. Then the distance creates more reaching, and suddenly both people are reacting to each other without realizing they have entered a cycle. This is the pursue-withdraw pattern. In an empath-avoidant relationship, it can begin with something incredibly small. The avoidant becomes quieter, less responsive, or emotionally unavailable. The empath senses the shift and wants to understand what happened, so they ask questions. They seek reassurance. They try to reconnect. But the avoidant may experience this increased emotional attention as pressure. Instead of feeling closer, they feel the urge to create even more space. And that withdrawal sends a powerful message to the empath. Something is wrong. I need to fix this. The empath reaches again. The avoidant retreats again. Now the cycle has momentum. What makes this pattern so exhausting is that both people may believe they are protecting themselves. The empath pursues because disconnection feels threatening. The avoidant withdraws because emotional intensity feels overwhelming. One is trying to restore connection. The other is trying to restore breathing room. Neither necessarily intends to hurt the other. But their coping strategies collide, and every round can make the emotional reaction stronger. The empath may become increasingly focused on the avoidant's behavior, checking for changes in tone, analyzing messages, wondering when affection will return. Meanwhile, the avoidant may begin associating emotional conversations with pressure, conflict, or loss of independence. Then comes the temporary reunion. The avoidant becomes warm again. The empath relaxes. The relationship feels safe. But unless the underlying pattern changes, the same trigger eventually returns. That is why simply getting back together after every withdrawal doesn't necessarily mean the relationship is healing. Reconnection is not the same as resolution. The cycle begins to break when both people stop automatically following their usual response. The empath learns to pause instead of chasing. The avoidant learns to communicate instead of disappearing. And both begin replacing emotional guessing with direct communication. Because healthy intimacy isn't about eliminating every moment of distance. It's about knowing that space won't become abandonment, and closeness won't become pressure. That is the emotional balance the pursue-withdraw cycle has been missing. Distance can create a psychological illusion. The less available someone becomes, the more valuable their attention can start to feel. That is one reason an empath may increase their effort when an avoidant partner pulls away. The empath doesn't necessarily want to chase. In the beginning, they may simply want clarity. But when answers don't come, the mind starts filling in the silence. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they need reassurance. Maybe I approached them the wrong way. Maybe if I give them more space, they'll come back. And slowly, the empath's attention shifts from experiencing the relationship to managing the distance. The strange part is that occasional closeness can make this even stronger. An avoidant partner might disappear emotionally for a while, then suddenly become affectionate, vulnerable, or deeply engaged. That brief return can feel disproportionately meaningful because it arrives after uncertainty. The empath feels relief, and relief can be mistaken for proof of extraordinary love. The mind begins waiting for the next moment of closeness. That creates a pattern where inconsistency becomes emotionally stimulating. The empath may start working harder, not because the relationship is becoming healthier, but because they are trying to recreate the moments when the avoidant finally felt reachable. This can turn ordinary relationship questions into an emotional mission. What do I need to do so they open up again? That question puts the entire relationship on the empath's shoulders. They become more accommodating. They suppress frustration. They give additional chances. They try to become easier to love, easier to communicate with, easier to be around. But genuine intimacy should not require someone to constantly redesign themselves around another person's withdrawal. There is another truth worth recognizing. An avoidance distance doesn't automatically mean they secretly love you more deeply. Sometimes, distance simply means they are unable or unwilling to offer the level of emotional availability you need. That distinction matters. Because once an empath stops treating withdrawal as a puzzle to solve, their behavior changes. They stop chasing every silence. They stop interpreting every small return as a breakthrough. They start observing consistency instead. And that is where emotional power shifts. The question is no longer, how can I make them come closer? It becomes, are they capable of meeting me halfway when I stop doing all the reaching? That question can reveal more about a relationship than 100 emotional conversations ever could. Compassion is beautiful, until you start using it to explain away everything that hurts you. An empath can understand an avoidant partner's fears, emotional walls, need for space, and difficulty expressing vulnerability. That understanding can create patience. It can soften judgment. It can make the relationship feel safer for both people. But there is a line between understanding someone's struggle and carrying it for them. That line is easy to cross when you deeply care. The empath begins thinking, they don't mean to hurt me. They're just scared. So the missed conversation gets forgiven. The emotional withdrawal gets explained. The broken promise gets another chance. The lack of communication becomes something the empath patiently waits through. None of this means the empath is foolish. In fact, the opposite can be true. Their ability to see beneath someone's behavior is often what makes them so compassionate. But empathy can become painful when understanding someone else's wounds makes you ignore your own. The relationship slowly becomes one-sided, not necessarily because the avoidant partner is intentionally selfish, but because the empath keeps compensating for what the other person isn't providing. They initiate difficult conversations. They repair misunderstandings. They regulate the emotional atmosphere. They constantly adjust their behavior to avoid triggering another withdrawal. Eventually, the empath may feel exhausted while still telling themselves, "I just need to be more understanding." That's the moment compassion needs a boundary. A healthy boundary doesn't say, "I don't care what you're going through." It says, "I care about what you're going through, and I also care about what this relationship is doing to me." That distinction protects empathy from becoming self-abandonment. An avoidant partner can have genuine fears and still be responsible for working on how those fears affect the relationship. You can offer patience without becoming their emotional caretaker. You can respect their need for space without accepting indefinite silence. You can understand their attachment style without using it to excuse behavior that repeatedly damages trust. Real compassion has two directions. It reaches toward the other person without turning its back on yourself. And when an empath learns that balance, love becomes less about rescuing someone from their emotional walls and more about discovering whether both people are willing to build a healthier connection together. The most confusing kind of attention isn't the attention that disappears completely. It's the attention that keeps returning just when you're beginning to give up. That pattern can create a powerful emotional attachment in an empath-avoidant relationship. One day, the avoidant partner feels warm, affectionate, present, and emotionally open. The empath feels connected again. Their nervous system relaxes because the uncertainty finally seems to be over. Then the distance returns. Messages become colder. Conversations become shorter. Emotional availability fades. The empath is left holding the memory of that earlier closeness. And that's where the emotional loop begins. Instead of judging the avoidant partner, it's important to understand what may be happening on both sides. An avoidant person may genuinely care while struggling with emotional closeness. Their moments of withdrawal aren't necessarily calculated attachment to create attachment. But for the empath, inconsistent connection can still be deeply confusing. The mind starts placing enormous value on the moments that feel good because they aren't guaranteed. A simple, affectionate message can suddenly feel like a breakthrough. A vulnerable conversation can feel like confirmation that the relationship is finally moving forward. A warm reunion can erase some of the pain created by the previous distance. Then hope returns. Maybe we're getting somewhere now. That hope can make the empath tolerate another period of uncertainty. This is why intermittent attention can become so emotionally powerful. You're not simply waiting for affection. You are waiting for the return of emotional relief. And the longer the uncertainty lasts, the more significant that relief can feel. But empathy requires nuance here. An avoidant partner isn't automatically manipulating someone simply because their availability is inconsistent. Their behavior may come from fear, emotional conditioning, difficulty with vulnerability, or an internal struggle between wanting connection and protecting independence. Understanding that can create compassion. But compassion should never require you to live permanently inside uncertainty. Healthy love doesn't need constant emotional highs and lows to feel meaningful. It can contain space without creating panic. It can contain independence without creating confusion. And it can contain vulnerability without making one person constantly wait for the other to return. The goal isn't to demand constant attention from an avoidant partner. The goal is to recognize that consistency matters just as much as chemistry. When an empath stops measuring love by the intensity of someone's returns and starts measuring it by the reliability of their presence, the relationship becomes much easier to see clearly. Sometimes, the strongest attachment isn't created by what someone gives you. It is created by what you keep hoping their love will finally prove. For an empath involved with an avoidant partner, that hope can quietly become personal. The empath may understand the avoidant's distance, recognize their fear of vulnerability, and see the tenderness hidden beneath their emotional walls. But underneath all that understanding, there may be another desire. If this person finally chooses me fully, maybe I'll finally feel worthy of being chosen. That doesn't mean every empath carries a deep wound, and it certainly doesn't mean their love is unhealthy. But when someone repeatedly finds themselves drawn toward emotionally unavailable partners, it can be valuable to look inward with curiosity rather than blame. Perhaps being needed feels safer than simply being loved. Perhaps earning closeness feels more familiar than receiving it freely. Perhaps the empath has become so comfortable caring for others that being cared for feels strangely unfamiliar. In that situation, the avoidance distance can become more than distance. It becomes a challenge. The empath may unconsciously begin trying to prove that they are patient enough, understanding enough, loving enough, or emotionally safe enough to finally reach the person behind the walls. Every small breakthrough feels deeply personal. Every retreat feels like a question about their worth. And this is where the relationship can become emotionally exhausting. Because the empath isn't only asking, "Will this person love me?" A deeper question may be hiding underneath. Can I finally make someone who struggles to choose closeness choose me? That is a painful burden to place on any relationship. Healing begins when the empath separates another person's emotional limitations from their own value. An avoidant's inability to communicate consistently does not prove that you are difficult to love. Their fear of intimacy does not mean you weren't safe enough. Their withdrawal does not automatically mean you failed. Sometimes the most important healing isn't learning how to reach the avoidant more effectively. It's learning that you don't have to earn the kind of love that is meant to meet you freely. And when that belief settles deeply, compassion becomes healthier. You can understand their wounds without making those wounds your responsibility. You can love someone without turning their emotional availability into a measurement of your worth. That is where the mirror stops asking, "How do I make them choose me?" and starts asking, "Why am I choosing a relationship where I have to keep proving I deserve to be chosen?" The cycle doesn't end when the avoidant finally becomes more affectionate. It ends when you stop participating in the pattern that keeps both of you emotionally stuck. That doesn't mean becoming cold, punishing the avoidant, or pretending you no longer care. It means changing the way you respond to distance. The first shift is simple but powerful. Stop treating every withdrawal as an emergency. When an avoidant becomes quiet, give yourself a moment before reaching out repeatedly. You don't need to immediately decode their mood, repair the atmosphere, or convince them that the relationship is safe. Let their behavior belong to them. If they need space, they can communicate that. If something is bothering them, they can express it. And if they choose to reconnect, allow that reconnection to come with responsibility, not just warmth. The second shift is learning to communicate your needs without turning them into demands. Instead of saying, "Why do you always disappear when I need you?" try something grounded. "I respect your need for space, but consistent communication matters to me. I want us to find a way to create space without losing connection." That statement leaves room for both people. You aren't attacking their coping style. You aren't abandoning your own needs either. The third shift is perhaps the hardest. Stop measuring the relationship by potential. Don't focus only on who the avoidant becomes during their best moments. Pay attention to the overall pattern. Are they gradually becoming more communicative? Do they take responsibility after withdrawing? Are they willing to understand your emotional needs too? Progress doesn't require perfection, but it does require participation. And finally, bring your attention back to yourself. Reconnect with your routines, friendships, goals, interests, and emotional world. Not as a strategy to make the avoidant miss you, but because your life should remain larger than one person's availability. You can love someone and still have boundaries. You can understand their fears without carrying them. You can give space without waiting indefinitely. And you can remain deeply compassionate without abandoning yourself. Breaking the empath-avoidant cycle isn't about choosing between love and self-respect. It's about creating enough self-respect that love no longer requires you to disappear inside someone else's emotional world. Healthy love doesn't make an empath stop being sensitive. It gives that sensitivity a place where it doesn't have to stay on high alert. For someone who naturally notices emotional shifts, healthy love feels different because you aren't constantly studying the relationship for signs that something has changed. You don't have to analyze every delayed response. You don't have to measure affection against yesterday. You don't have to wonder whether asking for reassurance will make someone disappear. There is still individuality. There is still personal space. There are still difficult days. But beneath those differences is something incredibly important: emotional reliability. A healthy partner doesn't need to be available every second. They can need quiet. They can become overwhelmed. They can have moments when they don't know what to say. The difference is that they don't leave you responsible for guessing what their silence means. They communicate. They return. They repair. And when something hurts, your feelings aren't treated like an inconvenience that needs to be removed. For an empath, this can initially feel surprisingly unfamiliar. You may discover that you're no longer performing emotional detective work. You aren't constantly trying to soften your words so someone won't withdraw. You aren't giving endless chances simply because you can understand the reason behind someone's behavior. Instead, you begin experiencing something much calmer: reciprocity. You care about their emotions, and they care about yours. You respect their boundaries, and they respect yours. You offer support, and you are also allowed to receive it. You give space without fearing abandonment. You express your needs without feeling guilty for having them. And perhaps most importantly, you don't have to become smaller to keep the relationship peaceful. Healthy love doesn't demand that an empath stop caring deeply. It teaches them that caring deeply and maintaining boundaries can exist together. You can be compassionate without becoming someone's emotional caretaker. You can understand someone's attachment wounds without accepting repeated behavior that damages your well-being. You can love an avoidant partner while still expecting communication, respect, consistency, and mutual effort. Because the goal isn't to find someone who never needs space. The goal is to find or build a connection where space doesn't destroy security, vulnerability doesn't create fear, and love doesn't require one person to constantly chase the other. For an empath, healthy love often feels less like an emotional storm and more like finally being able to breathe. The biggest change doesn't happen when the avoidant finally becomes everything you hoped for. It happens when your definition of love changes. You stop measuring connection by intensity and start measuring it by consistency. You stop asking how deeply someone feels and begin noticing how consistently they show up. That shift can feel uncomfortable at first, because an empath may be accustomed to reading between the lines. A warm message feels significant. A sudden return feels meaningful. A vulnerable conversation feels like proof that the relationship is finally moving forward. But eventually, something becomes clear. A beautiful moment cannot carry an entire relationship. What matters is the pattern surrounding that moment. Does the avoidant communicate after creating distance? Do they acknowledge when their withdrawal affects you? Do they make an effort to understand your emotional needs? Are you both learning how to handle closeness and space more safely? Those questions move you away from fantasy and toward reality. And this doesn't require you to become suspicious or emotionally detached. Quite the opposite. You can remain compassionate while becoming more discerning. You can say, "I understand why you need space," without saying, "I'll accept unlimited emotional distance." You can say, "I care about what you're going through," without taking responsibility for fixing it. You can give someone room without putting your own life on pause. That is the shift. The empath stops trying to earn security through endless patience and starts creating security through self-respect, boundaries, and honest communication. And something beautiful happens when that occurs. The relationship no longer revolves around the question, "How do I get them to come closer?" Instead, both people face a healthier question. Can we create a relationship where neither of us has to chase or disappear to feel safe? If the avoidant is willing to grow, this shift can create space for genuine healing. If they aren't, the same shift still protects the empath from losing themselves inside the relationship. Either way, you gain something valuable: clarity. Because love isn't proven by how long you can tolerate uncertainty. It isn't measured by how much emotional pain you can understand. And it certainly isn't earned by becoming endlessly convenient for someone else. The healthiest version of empathy is not self-sacrifice. It is the ability to understand another person's heart while still listening to your own. And when you finally learn that, you don't stop loving deeply. You simply stop abandoning yourself to be loved.